She became jealous, thinking that her boss had fallen for her friend. But what happens next will shock everyone. Hello, my wonderful friends. Welcome back to this exciting movie journey with us. Get ready as we bring you the undiluted story of this fascinating Nigerian movie, packed with hidden morals and valuable life lessons that we will be revealing to you. Don't go anywhere. Sit tight, grab your popcorn, and enjoy this thrilling ride with us. But before we continue, make sure to subscribe because we have plenty of exciting movie goodies coming your way. All right, let's dive in. Maria, a diligent housekeeper, works for Mr. James. That morning, she prepared a cup of coffee for him. Meanwhile, Mr. James woke up to the sound of his alarm ringing loudly. He got up, said his prayers, and then Maria entered to serve his coffee. She also placed his office clothes on his bed before leaving the room to prepare breakfast. An hour later, Maria served breakfast at the dining table. Mr. James, impressed by her swiftness, exchanged pleasantries with her and thanked her for preparing his meal on time. Maria explained that she had woken up early because he had mentioned the previous day that he needed to leave for the office very early. He thanked her again and invited her to join him at the table, but she politely declined, saying she would eat in the kitchen. As Maria walked to the kitchen, she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her stomach, but chose not to mention it to Mr. James. When Mr. James was ready to leave for work, Maria carried his suitcase to the car. The gateman, Senator, greeted Mr. James, and Mr. James jokingly remarked that his name was quite expensive. Senator laughed and replied that he was the only senator without a constituency. They both chuckled, and Senator proceeded to open the gate for Mr. James to drive out. Mr. James was a kind boss who maintained a cordial relationship with his staff. As Maria walked back into the house, Senator called out to her. She assumed he was asking for food and assured him that his meal would be ready soon. However, Senator clarified that wasn't why he called her. Instead, he asked if she was feeling okay. Maria assured him she was fine. Then Senator teased her, saying he noticed how she carried Mr. James's suitcase and wondered if she was going to be his wife soon. Maria laughed, told him he wasn't serious, and went inside. Inside the house, Maria called her sister to inform her that she had managed to send her some money, thanks to Mr. James, who often gave her extra aside from her salary. She advised her sister to stay focused on her studies, and after exchanging goodbyes, she ended the call. Later that night, during dinner, Maria wasn't eating. Instead, she was playing with her food. Mr. James noticed and asked if she was okay. Misunderstanding him, Maria got up to take his dish to the kitchen, but he gently held her hand and told her not to worry. He then realized she had a fever and advised her to rest while he took his dish to the kitchen himself. Maria quietly said to herself how grateful she was to have such an understanding boss, then continued eating. The next morning, Mr. James walked into the sitting room, wondering why Maria hadn't brought his coffee yet. He was shocked to find Maria groaning in pain on the floor, clutching her stomach. Without hesitation, he quickly carried her to the hospital. A few weeks later, Maria returned from the hospital. Mr. James asked how she was feeling and expressed his disappointment that she had endured so much pain without telling him. Maria apologized, and their bond grew stronger. Then, Mr. James told Maria to relax until she fully recovers, but Maria became concerned about who would handle the house chores. Mr. James assured her that he would hire someone to work temporarily until she was strong enough to resume her duties. Now, what do you think about Mr. James's kindness toward Maria? Do you believe a good boss-employee relationship can feel like family? Let us know in the comments. The next morning, Maria had a dream that she was pregnant with Mr. James's baby and that they were married. When she woke up, she saw Mr. James bringing her breakfast, which made her think the dream was coming true. Surprised, she told him he wasn't supposed to bring her breakfast, but he smiled and told her not to worry. He chose to do it for her since she was still recovering. Then he left for work. Later, Maria received a call from her friend Kamsy, who was in the village. Kamsy told Maria that she had lost her father and that her stepmother was trying to marry her off. Desperate for help, she begged Maria to assist her in leaving the village. Maria promised to help. That evening, Maria met Mr. James in the sitting room and thanked him for taking care of her and for paying for her surgery. Mr. James told her it was no problem, as he saw her like a sister. Maria then brought up the idea of Kamsy filling in for her temporarily until she was strong enough to resume her duties. Mr. James agreed, and Maria was overjoyed, thanking him sincerely. A few days later, Kamsy arrived in the city. Maria welcomed her warmly, and out of excitement, Kamsy hugged her so tightly that Maria had to remind her about her surgery and the pain she was still feeling. Kamsy quickly apologized. Maria took Kamsy to her room and told her they would be staying together. Kamsy was so happy that she began praying for Maria and thanking her for helping her. Maria then gave Kamsy some information about Mr. James and how kind he was before taking her on a tour of the house. When Mr. James returned from work, both Maria and Kamsy welcomed him. Maria introduced Kamsy to him, and Kamsy thanked Mr. James for accommodating her. Mr. James told her she had Maria to thank for speaking on her behalf, then excused himself and went to his room. A few days later, Kamsy walked into the room to find Maria packing her clothes. Maria explained that she wanted to spend some time with her family for a few days. Kamsy told her she would miss her, and Maria asked her to take care of Mr. James in her absence. She also gave Kamsy further instructions on handling household chores. Kamsy helped her pack her clothes into her bag. Later that day, while cleaning Mr. James's room, Kamsy picked up a book from his bedside table and said to herself that one day she would own a big house with a library full of books. Suddenly, Senator startled her, making her jump. Annoyed, she asked him why he scared her like that. Senator then handed her some gift bags from Mr. James. Kamsy told him he could have just left them in the sitting room instead of bringing them to her in Mr. James's room. She took the bags, placed them in the room, and went back to her work. The next day, Mr. James called Kamsy and asked for her opinion on which tie matched his outfit better, the red or the blue one. Kamsy suggested the blue tie, and Mr. James thanked her, calling her smart. He then asked if she knew how to drive, but Kamsy said not yet. Mr. James told her she needed to learn in case he ever needed her to warm up his car before work. The following day, while ironing Mr. James's clothes, Kamsy accidentally burned one. She immediately started shouting as if she were in serious trouble, because, in her mind, she was. Mr. James walked into the room and Kamsy knelt down, pleading with him. She explained that it was an accident, but instead of getting angry, Mr. James told her not to worry and just to be more careful next time. Then, he asked her what dress size she wore. Kamsy replied, "Size 8, and he simply left. Confused, she muttered to herself, wondering if Mr. James was planning to sew a prison uniform for her. After that, she stopped ironing. The next day, when Mr. James returned from work, Kamsy came out to welcome him and helped carry the items he bought from his car. Meanwhile, Senator reminded Mr. James that he needed engine oil for greasing the gate. While Kamsy was walking inside the house, Senator started hailing her, calling her the walking dictionary. She warned him not to call her that and then went inside Mr. James's room to drop the items he had bought. However, Mr. James told her the bags belonged to her because they contained clothes. Kamsy thanked him and appreciated his kindness. Do you think Kamsy will fit in well, or will something unexpected happen? Later that same day, while in the room, Kamsy called Maria and told her about the incident with Mr. James's burnt clothes. She was surprised that he didn't react at all. She also mentioned that Mr. James was very nice and that whoever married him would be lucky. Then, she told Maria about the clothes Mr. James had bought for her and asked how she was doing. After their conversation, they said their goodbyes. The next day, Kamsy went to clean Mr. James's room and started reading one of his books. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice when Mr. James walked in. When she realized she wasn't alone, she quickly stood up and apologized. Mr. James told her to take the book with her and return it whenever she was done reading. Kamsy thanked him and left the room. The following day, while Kamsy was serving Mr. James his food at the dining table, he asked her about her favorite character in the book she had read. She shared her thoughts, and they started discussing it. Mr. James then invited her to sit with him so they could talk more about herself. During their conversation, Mr. James told Kamsy that she seemed like a smart lady and asked about her plans. Kamsy told him that she wanted to go back to school and explained the reasons why she had dropped out. The next morning, Kamsy brought Mr. James his coffee in his room. After taking a sip, he noticed it wasn't sweet. Kamsy told him she had reduced the sugar from 4 cubes to 1 because sugar wasn't good for his health. Mr. James told her that next time she should ask before making such changes. She quickly apologized. Later that day, Mr. James was sitting quietly outside when Kamsy brought him a glass of drink. She asked if he was okay and if he wanted to talk about whatever was on his mind. Mr. James admitted that something was bothering him, so Kamsy sat down to listen. A week later, Maria returned from her trip. Kamsy was so happy to see her that she hugged her tightly. Maria reminded her that she was still in pain from her surgery, and Kamsy quickly apologized. Then they went inside together. Later that same day, Kamsy approached Mr. James and begged him to let her stay a little longer, even though Maria had returned to resume her duties. She explained that she needed time to save enough money to rent an apartment for herself. Mr. James agreed, saying that Maria enjoyed her company, so she could stay for the time being. Kamsy thanked him and left his room. The next day, Kamsy and Maria were on their way home from somewhere when Kamsy urged Maria to walk faster. Maria explained that she couldn't because she was still feeling pain in her stomach. Kamsy then revealed why she was in such a hurry. Mr. James had given her a book to read and challenged her to finish it in 48 hours, and she wanted to prove him wrong. She referred to Mr. James as Sir J, and Maria asked who she was calling that. Kamsy explained that she sometimes called Mr. James Sir J. Maria didn't say anything. Since Maria was still walking slowly, Kamsy left her and went home ahead. The next day, Kamsy excitedly entered the room and showed Maria the ice cream Mr. James had bought for both of them. However, Maria said she didn't want any. Kamsy immediately assumed Maria was angry because she had left her to walk home alone the previous day, so she quickly apologized. From that moment, their relationship started drifting apart. That evening, during dinner with Mr. James, Kamsy and Mr. James got into a debate about certain characters in the book they had read. Maria felt left out, but didn't say anything. Then, Mr. James turned to Maria and asked if she had read the book. Before she could answer, Kamsy interrupted and said Maria was more into Korean movies than reading. Maria was hurt that her own friend would use her interests to mock her, but she remained silent throughout the conversation. Later, in the kitchen, Maria muttered to herself that Kamsy's closeness with Mr. James was getting out of hand, and that she wasn't comfortable with it. It seemed Maria was starting to feel a bit jealous. She had never had deep discussions with Mr. James, and now Kamsy was getting all the attention. Was Kamsy really doing too much, or was Maria just overthinking things? What do you think? While Maria was lying in bed, Kamsy came in and started talking about her conversation with Mr. James. Maria, feeling irritated, spoke out loudly, saying she didn't want to know and just wanted to sleep. After that, they both went to bed. The next morning, Maria was busy in the kitchen when Kamsy came in and asked if she needed help, but Maria refused. Kamsy then went to the fridge to get a bottle of water, but as she turned, she accidentally stepped on Maria's foot. Maria suddenly started shouting at her. Kamsy was shocked by Maria's reaction and quickly apologized, explaining that it wasn't intentional. Still surprised by Maria's attitude, Kamsy quietly stepped out of the kitchen. Later that day, when Mr. James returned from work, he called Kamsy and handed her a form he had bought for her to continue her part-time studies. Kamsy was overjoyed and hugged Mr. James in excitement. Maria saw this from a distance, placed her hands on her head, and sighed deeply. She felt as though Kamsy had taken her boss away from her. Maria went into the room, struggling to believe what she had just witnessed. Moments later, Kamsy excitedly rushed in to share the good news. But Maria, blinded by jealousy and anger, wasn't happy for her. Instead, she told Kamsy it was time for her to leave. Kamsy reminded her that she had already spoken to Mr. James about staying for a while, which made Maria even more upset. Kamsy apologized, but Maria wasn't satisfied and left the room. Maria then went to see Mr. James and told him that she could now handle all the house chores by herself, so Kamsy was no longer needed. Mr. James tried to reason with her, saying he couldn't just throw Kamsy out after she had explained her situation to him. Then, Mr. James asked Maria to sit down because he had something important to discuss with her. He told Maria that there was a lady he liked and wanted to spend forever with. He explained that he was sharing this with her because he saw her as a sister. Hearing this, Maria felt as if she had lost Mr. James to Kamsy. She immediately assumed that the lady he was talking about was Kamsy, and her heart sank. She sat there quietly, listening, though her thoughts were in turmoil. Later that night, Kamsy was searching for something and unintentionally disturbed Maria's sleep. Annoyed, Maria woke up and told her to stop disturbing her. Kamsy explained that she needed a sanitary pad because her menstrual cycle had just started. Instead of offering help, Maria sarcastically told her to ask Mr. James to buy it for her, since he was always the one providing for her. Kamsy found Maria's response petty and childish, so she simply stepped out of the room. The next morning, Maria and Kamsy passed each other in the compound like total strangers. Their tension was so obvious that even Senator noticed it and jokingly said there was a war happening in the house, a war without guns or knives. The next day was Maria's birthday. Mr. James and Kamsy celebrated her with a cake, wine, and birthday decorations, but Maria remained cold towards Kamsy. Nevertheless, Kamsy acted maturely and celebrated with her. Mr. James even offered to take Maria out, but she refused and chose to stay at home. The following day, Kamsy approached Maria in the kitchen and told her she was going shopping with Mr. James. She mentioned that Mr. James wanted Maria to come along too, but Maria coldly declined, saying she wasn't interested. Kamsy left alone. At the boutique, Kamsy and Mr. James picked out some dresses. Guys, what do you think is going on here? When they returned home from their shopping spree, even Senator started suspecting that Mr. James was up to something with his growing closeness to Kamsy. Meanwhile, Maria overheard Kamsy and Mr. James chatting and laughing. She couldn't help but peek at them, and as she watched, sadness filled her heart. Do you think Maria is overreacting, or is there really something going on between Kamsy and Mr. James? Share your thoughts in the comments. The next morning, as Mr. James was leaving for work, Maria quickly grabbed his suitcase before Kamsy could. Kamsy looked at her as if they were competing for something. Mr. James then asked Kamsy if she was studying for her exams, and she confirmed that she was. After that, he left for work. Outside the compound, Mr. James noticed Maria had been quiet and distant lately. He asked if she was okay, but Maria simply told him she was fine. Inside the house, Kamsy confronted Maria and asked how long they were going to keep avoiding each other. She reminded Maria that they were supposed to be friends, but now they were acting like the villains she read about in books. Maria, however, didn't care and walked away. Later, Maria went into Mr. James's room to gather his dirty clothes for washing. While checking the pockets, she found a small box containing an engagement ring. She immediately remembered the conversation she had with Mr. James about a lady he liked. Shocked, she placed the box back and left the room. Maria then returned to the room she shared with Kamsy. The moment Kamsy saw her, she became startled. Maria, believing that Mr. James had bought the ring to propose to Kamsy, became angry and started saying hurtful words. Hurt and frustrated, Kamsy decided to pack her things and leave the house. Later that day, Mr. James came back from work and handed Maria a bag containing some books for Kamsy. Maria, however, lied to him, saying that Kamsy had gone back to the village to be with the man who wanted to marry her. Disappointed, Mr. James believed Maria's story and quietly went to his room. It seems Maria has a strong crush on Mr. James, but doesn't know how to express her feelings. That night, Mr. James tried calling Kamsy, but she didn't answer, leaving him looking worried. The next morning, Maria served Mr. James his usual cup of coffee, but he complained that it was too sweet. Surprised, Maria told him that she had used the same amount of sugar she always did. Mr. James then explained that he had reduced his sugar intake since Kamsy advised him to, and now he was used to it. He went on to say that he couldn't believe Kamsy would leave without telling him. Maria, pretending to be innocent, acted as though she had no role in Kamsy's departure. A few days later, Mr. James came home in a joyful mood. Curious, Maria asked what had happened. Smiling, he told her that he had just proposed to his girlfriend and even showed her a picture. At that moment, Maria realized Kamsy had done nothing wrong and began to feel guilty. She went into her room, crying, and asked God for forgiveness for what she had done. She then tried calling Kamsy, but Kamsy refused to pick up. The next day, while washing dishes in the kitchen, Maria found herself crying as she remembered the first time Kamsy came to Mr. James's house. Later that same day, Mr. James returned from work and noticed Maria's sad expression. When he asked what was wrong, Maria tearfully confessed the real reason why Kamsy had left. Mr. James was disappointed but forgave her. A few days later, Maria went to a restaurant to get something and unexpectedly saw Kamsy. However, Kamsy wasn't happy to see her. Maria quickly begged her not to leave and started apologizing for what she had done. They sat down to talk, and Maria explained that she acted out of jealousy because Mr. James had become fond of Kamsy, and she had assumed they were in a relationship. Kamsy told her that she could have simply asked instead of jumping to conclusions. In the end, Kamsy forgave her. Do you think Maria's jealousy was understandable, or did she go too far? Let us know in the comments. Maria got home and told Mr. James that she had seen Kamsy at the restaurant while getting something for him. Mr. James was happy to hear the news. A few days later, Kamsy visited Mr. James and Maria at home to thank them for all they had done for her, especially Mr. James. Mr. James then invited her to move back in with them, but Kamsy politely declined, explaining that her school and workplace were far from his house and she was planning to get her own apartment. Mr. James offered to support her financially, and she thanked him. The next day, Mr. James met Maria in the kitchen and informed her that he was expecting a guest. He asked her to collaborate with Kamsy to decorate the house to make it welcoming. After giving her the task, he left her to continue with her work. Later that day, Maria met up with Kamsy. During their conversation, Kamsy mentioned that she would be finishing school soon. Maria excitedly told her that on her convocation day, she would make sure there was a big celebration so that people would know Kamsy had loved ones supporting her. They also started planning how to welcome Mr. James's guest. The next day, Mr. James arrived home with his fiancée, Maid. She was delighted to see how beautifully they had decorated the house and thanked Maria and Kamsy for taking care of Mr. James. Later, Maria and Kamsy went into their room. Maria admitted that she couldn't believe she had fought with Kamsy over Mr. James, who wasn't even interested in her in that way. Maria then told Kamsy that she had learned her lesson. Kamsy also acknowledged that she might have overstepped her boundaries at times. They both apologized and hugged. And that's it for this exciting episode, guys. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notification bell for more interesting and fascinating episodes like this. Till we meet again, goodbye.